"I've never been kissed," the giant widow said, and the words hung in the twilight like a ghost. The rancher, standing 3 steps below her, took off his hat, not out of courtesy, but like a man laying down a weapon before a duel. He looked up, his eyes seeming to bore right through the walls she'd spent a lifetime building. "Let's start slow," he said. But this wasn't the beginning of a gentle courtship. This was the first move in a game neither of them understood, a story that would be carved into the history of this territory, not because it was right, but because it was bloody. Before the legend people would whisper around campfires, there was just this: a woman whose hands were shaking not from fear, but from a rage she couldn't name, and a man whose breath was held not in anticipation, but in calculation. This wasn't about love, it was about survival. And it had started long before he ever knocked on her door. Ingrid Sorensen stood 6'2", and she'd learned early that the world had no room for a woman her size. She'd stopped hunching her shoulders at 23 and married Lars Sorensen at 25, a man who saw her strength not as a virtue, but as a tool. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a ranch hand he didn't have to pay. Everyone called Lars kind at his funeral. Kind. The word was a flimsy blanket thrown over a cold, empty bed. Kindness couldn't fill the dead air at the dinner table. Kindness couldn't bridge the chasm between 2 people sharing a roof, but not a life. He died 2 winters ago, they said. Pneumonia, a quick, clean death. She nursed him, spooned broth between his lips, felt his fever burn, and when his last ragged breath left his body, the first thing she felt was relief. The charade was over. But the silence he left behind was heavier than his presence had ever been. It was a suffocating loneliness that turned every sunrise into a curse. So she worked. She worked until her muscles screamed and her mind went blank. She fed the chickens, mended the fences, split the wood, anything to be too exhausted to feel the emptiness clawing at her from the other side of the bed. The neighbors, they'd drop off supplies sometimes, but they never lingered. She was too much for them. Too tall, too capable, too quiet. All except him, Jacob Henriksen, from the next ranch over. She'd see his silhouette on the ridge at dawn, a silent watcher. He never waved, just a slow tip of his hat if she caught his eye. He was a ghost on the edge of her world, until 3 months ago. That's when things started to change. A stack of firewood appeared by her shed, cut and stacked, wood she never touched. A broken gate hinge was suddenly solid, the metal new and gleaming. Then, the venison, hanging in her smokehouse, freshly dressed. It wasn't a gift. It felt like a message. She knew it was him. No one else ever came this far out. She finally caught him last week, red-handed, replacing a rotted post on her north fence line. He'd looked up, not startled, but caught. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his eyes steady. "Thought you could use the help," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. "I didn't ask for it," she shot back. "I know." The wind howled between them, carrying 1,000 unspoken words. He mounted his horse and rode off, but the line had been crossed. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was real, and he was trespassing on her solitude. Tonight, he'd knocked on her door. Actually knocked. They sat on the porch steps, the sky bleeding out into bruised purple. He talked about safe things, the ranch, spring planting, the railroad rumored to be coming through. But under the surface of his words, she felt a current, something dangerous and pulling. And before she knew what she was doing, the truth spilled out of her, a truth so raw it felt like tearing her own skin off. "I was married for 2 years," she'd said, her voice shaking, "and I've never been kissed." Not in a way that mattered. The confession just hung there, and that's when he took off his hat. "Let's start slow." The words echoed in the sudden silence. "I don't know what that means," she said, her voice rough. It was a warning. "It means I come by tomorrow," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening valley. "Help with whatever needs doing. We talk. No expectations. Why? The question was a challenge. Why her? Why this charade of kindness? He looked out at the endless expanse of Wyoming. Because I'm tired of being alone, he said. The words were simple, but they felt rehearsed. Because I see you working this place to the bone, and I think maybe we could carry the load together. He turned then, and his eyes pinned her to the spot. And because when I look at you, I don't see someone who's too much of anything. I see someone who's exactly right. It was the perfect thing to say. Too perfect. A key sliding into a lock she didn't know she had. A part of her, a part she thought had died with Lars, cracked open. She'd spent years building these walls, brick by painful brick. I don't know how to trust this, she whispered. It was the truest thing she'd said all night. Then don't, he said, his voice softening. Not yet. Just let me show up tomorrow. He studied her face, his expression unreadable in the dying light. His eyes seemed kind, but there was something else behind them, something hard and old. All right, she found herself saying. Tomorrow. He stood, placing his hat back on his head like a crown. I'll bring coffee, the good kind. I can make my own coffee. I know you can, he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. But you shouldn't have to make everything yourself. He walked to his horse, mounted, and then looked back, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Ingrid, he said, and the way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. What you told me tonight. That took courage. Don't think for a second I don't know that. He rode off, disappearing into the dark like he was part of it. And Ingrid sat there, tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of hope. They were tears of confusion. Because a man like that, a man with perfect words and watchful eyes, didn't just appear out of nowhere. He was here for a reason. And a cold, hard knot in her stomach told her it had nothing to do with her loneliness, and everything to do with the man who died in her bed 2 winters ago. Hope was a fool's game. This was something else entirely. And she had a terrible feeling that tomorrow, when he returned with his good coffee and his easy smile, the real story would begin. She went inside, the cold finally seeping into her bones. She ate her supper without tasting it, her mind racing. She banked the fire and climbed into her cold, empty bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the dark, listening to the house groan around her, and she didn't imagine a shared future. She imagined a shared past, a past between Jacob Henriksen and her dead husband, Lars. What had he meant? That took courage. It was a strange thing to say. It wasn't pity. It sounded like recognition, as if he knew the secrets she kept buried even from herself, as if he knew that not being kissed was the least of them. Outside, the Wyoming night was vast and indifferent. The stars were cold, distant fires. Somewhere across that valley, Jacob was in his own bed, but she knew he wasn't wondering if tomorrow would change everything. He knew it would. He was counting on it. He hadn't come to her porch by chance. He'd been sent, or he was hunting for something. All she knew for sure was this. Tomorrow he would come, and she would let him. Not out of hope, but because the only way to find out what the fox wants is to let it into the hen house. For now, that was enough. He arrived with the dawn, just as she knew he would. 2 tin cups of coffee steamed in the crisp air, a peace offering, or a distraction. Ingrid's heart didn't kick with excitement. It steadied into a cold, rhythmic drum. She'd been up for hours, not changing her dress, but cleaning Lars's old shotgun. She met him on the porch, taking the cup he offered. The warmth was a lie against the chill in her gut. Real coffee, not the chicory-laced dust she'd been drinking. A calculated kindness. Thank you, she said, her voice flat. He just nodded, his eyes already scanning the property, not like a man looking for work, but like a man assessing a battlefield. What needs doing? She pointed to the barn. Roof's got a leak. They worked all morning. the silence between them thick and heavy. He moved with a practiced economy, his hands sure and steady. He'd hand her a shingle, she'd hammer it down. Their rhythm was too easy, too perfect, like they'd done this 100 times before. Their hands brushed, reaching for a nail, and she didn't jerk back. She met his eyes and held them for a beat too long. He was the one who looked away first. By noon, the roof was patched. They sat on overturned buckets in the barn's shadow. She'd brought bread and the last of her jam. They ate, the silence stretching. "Tell me something," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Something you've never told anyone." She chewed her bread, her mind a whirlwind. She wouldn't give him her fear. She'd give him a piece of the truth, a small piece, to see what he did with it. Lars didn't die of pneumonia. Jacob didn't so much as flinch. He just kept looking at her, his expression unchanging. "No?" The doctor said it was, but it was too fast. He was strong as an ox one day and gone the next. There was a smell. Not of sickness. Something else. Like chemicals. She watched his face, looking for a flicker, a sign of recognition. Nothing. He was a stone wall. "A lot of sicknesses move fast out here," he said, his voice even. It was a dismissal. He was trying to control the conversation. "You knew him, didn't you?" she pressed. "Lars, before he died." He set down his bread, his movements deliberate. "I knew of him. Everyone in the valley knows their neighbors." "No," she said, standing up, the pretense of a shared meal over. "You knew him. The way you look at this place. The way you knew exactly which fence post was rotting. You've been here before." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said. It was a sharp turn, a blatant redirection. "Childbirth. The baby, too. After that, I just shut down. Figured that was all there was left." It was a sad story. It was meant to be. A story designed to build a bridge of shared grief between them. She felt a pang of something, maybe pity, but she stamped it out. Pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," she said, "because it was what you were supposed to say." "Me too," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "But lately, I've been thinking maybe we're not meant to just survive. Maybe there's supposed to be more." He was good. He was very, very good. He was weaving a narrative, a story of two lonely souls finding solace. And every instinct she had screamed that it was a lie. "What did you and Lars talk about?" she asked, her voice like ice. A gust of wind kicked up dust between them. For the first time, a crack appeared in his calm facade. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "We talked about the railroad." "What about it?" "He was worried," Jacob said, his eyes scanning the horizon again. "Worried they'd try to push him off his land. He said he had insurance. Something to make sure they paid him fair." "Insurance?" The word hung in the air. "What kind of insurance?" "He never said." Jacob stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. "I should get back to work. The garden needs turning, if you're willing." He was shutting it down again, giving her a piece of the puzzle, then snatching the rest away. She almost said no. But that would be the end of it. He would leave, and she would be alone with her questions. "Fine," she said. "The garden." They spent the afternoon in a silent battle, their shovels turning the earth. The work was hard, punishing, but the physical strain did nothing to ease the tension. With every spadeful of dirt, she felt like she was digging for answers. The sun began to dip low, painting the sky in fiery colors. "You don't have to keep coming," she said, straightening her back. "I know you've got your own place to run." "I want to come," he said, leaning on his shovel. "Why?" she asked again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Why, Jacob? What insurance did my husband have? And what does it have to do with you?" He set down his shovel and took a step closer. His face was grim. "Because yesterday you told me a secret, And people who share secrets have to trust each other. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting for now, he said. Lars was a complicated man, Ingrid. He got himself into something deep. I'm trying to get you out of it. What something? She demanded, her voice rising. You're not broken, he said, his voice suddenly gentle, and the shift was so jarring it threw her off balance. You're just hurt. There's a difference. He was doing it again, answering her fury with softness, trying to disarm her. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes and she blinked them away. Stop it, she whispered. Stop talking to me like that. Like what? Like you care. He was silent. The hawk circling overhead cried out, a lonely, piercing sound. I should head back, he said finally. I'll come again Thursday. He walked to his horse, but paused, his hand on the saddle. Ingrid, you ask why I'm here. The real reason is this. Lars made a promise to me, a promise he broke, and I aim to see it kept. He mounted and rode away, leaving her standing in the freshly turned earth, his words echoing in her ears. A broken promise. He wasn't here to help her. He was here to collect a debt owed by a dead man. And she, standing on the land Lars had left her, was the collateral. The hope she'd been so afraid of last night seemed like a distant, childish dream. This wasn't about a new beginning. It was about an old, ugly ending. And she was standing right in the middle of it. That night, she didn't just lie awake. She searched. She tore apart the small cabin, looking for this insurance Jacob had mentioned. She ripped open Lars's old mattress, pulled up floorboards, sifted through the ashes in the hearth. Nothing. It was as if Lars had been a ghost in his own home, leaving nothing of himself behind. Defeated, she slumped at the kitchen table as the moon climbed high in the sky. Her eyes fell on the heavy family Bible, the one Lars's mother had given them. Lars had never opened it. He wasn't a religious man. Her fingers traced the worn leather cover. On a whim, she opened it. And there, tucked between the pages of Leviticus, was not a document, but a photograph. A faded, dog-eared picture of two men standing together, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, squinting in the bright sun. One was a younger Lars, the other was Jacob. They were smiling, looking not like neighbors, but like brothers, and behind them was a crude hand-painted sign that read, Henriksen and Sorensen Mining Co. Jacob hadn't just known her husband. They'd been partners, and he had lied to her face. Every word out of his mouth, about his wife, about his loneliness, about her being exactly right. It was all a carefully constructed fiction. The chill that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the cold of the cabin. Jacob wasn't here to collect a debt from Lars. He was here to find whatever they had discovered together. The insurance. And he was using her loneliness, as his key. The game had just changed, and she was no longer a pawn. She was a player. Thursday came with a vengeance. The sky opened up, a cold, driving rain that turned the world to a gray, muddy mess. He won't come, she thought, a grim satisfaction settling in her chest. The storm would keep him away, give her time to think, to plan. She stood at the window, the photograph from the Bible burning a hole in her pocket, and watched the ridge. The rain hammered the roof, a relentless, angry drumming. By noon, the valley was a blur of shifting water and wind. Of course he wouldn't come. It would be madness. Then she heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been there. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then growing stronger, closer, cutting through the roar of the storm. She threw open the door, and there he was, a dark figure materializing out of the deluge. He was soaked, water streaming from the brim of his hat, his horse a shivering, miserable creature. He didn't even look at her. He dismounted and led the horse straight for the barn, his movements urgent, almost frantic. He wasn't here for conversation. He was running. She followed him into the dry, dusty air of the barn. He stripped off his coat, his back to her, and hung it on a nail. When he finally turned, the look on his face stopped her cold. The mask was gone. The calm, steady rancher had vanished. In his place was a man who was cornered, hunted. "You came," she said, the words sounding hollow. "Said I would." His voice was rough, strained. "The storm. I've ridden through worse." He wasn't looking at her, but past her, his eyes fixed on the path leading back to the ridge, as if he was expecting someone to follow. The rain pounded on the roof, a deafening roar that filled the space between them. "Why did you really come, Jacob?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp as a razor. "You could have waited for the weather to clear. Unless you couldn't. Unless you were afraid someone else might get here first." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were burning. "I was afraid if I didn't come, you'd think I'd changed my mind," he said, the old lie sounding weak and pathetic in the face of the truth raging outside. "Try again," she said, her hand closing around the photograph in her pocket. "Try the truth this time. Partner." The word hit him like a physical blow. She saw his shoulders tense, his hands clench into fists. The silence in the barn was suddenly more deafening than the storm. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of fury and... Was that fear? "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Does it matter?" she shot back. "Henriksen and Sorensen Mining Co. Looks like you were more than just neighbors. Looks like you were brothers. So why the act, Jacob? Why the sad story about your dead wife? Why lie to me?" "Because the truth would get you killed," he exploded, taking a step toward her, his face contorted with a desperation she hadn't seen before. "The truth is what killed Lars. The truth is what killed my wife." The barn seemed to shrink around them. His words, shouted over the storm, hung in the air, electric and terrifying. His wife. He'd told her his wife died in childbirth. Another lie. Everything was a lie. "What truth?" she whispered, her own anger momentarily eclipsed by the raw terror in his voice. Before he could answer, another sound cut through the rain. The sharp, distinct crack of a rifle shot. It was close. Too close. Jacob reacted instantly. He lunged, grabbing her and pulling her down behind a stack of hay bales. "Get down and stay down," he hissed, his body shielding hers. He pulled a pistol from inside his shirt, the metal cold and deadly. The quiet rancher was gone. This was a man who knew violence. "Who's out there?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The railroad," he said, his eyes scanning the barn door. "Or rather, the men they hire to clean up their messes. They're not here to talk about land prices, Ingrid. They're here for what Lars found." "What did he find?" "Gold," Jacob said, his voice grim. "A whole damn river of it, right under this valley, under your land, under mine. We were going to be rich, him and me. But Lars got greedy. He tried to cut a side deal with the railroad, sell us out. They didn't want a partner, though. They wanted it all." He risked a glance over the hay. "They silenced him, made it look like pneumonia. And now they've come back for the map he made showing the main vein." Another shot splintered the wood of the barn door. They were trapped. "Where is the map?" she asked, her mind racing. "I don't know," he said, the frustration clear in his voice. "I thought he hid it here on his half of the claim. That's why I've been coming here, fixing things, searching. I needed to find it before they did." So that was it. The firewood, the fence post, the kindness. It was all a cover for his search. He wasn't protecting her. He was using her land as his treasure map. "And your wife?" she asked, the question tasting like ash in her mouth. His face hardened into a mask of grief. "She found out about Lars's deal, threatened to expose everyone. One of their men ran her buggy off the road, made it look like an accident." He swallowed hard. "This isn't just about gold for me anymore. This is about vengeance." The barn door creaked open, pushed by the wind. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray, stormy light. A man in a long black coat, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "Henriksen!" the man called out, his voice smooth and cold. "I know you're in there. The woman, too. We have the place surrounded. Just give us the map, and we'll let her walk away. You have my word." Jacob tensed beside her. "Don't listen to him," he whispered. "His name is Sterling. His word isn't worth the spit it's written on. He's the one who killed my wife." Sterling took a step inside, the rain dripping from his hat. "Lars was a fool, Henriksen. He thought he could play both sides. Don't you make the same mistake. Where is it?" Ingrid's mind was a frantic blur. The map. Where would a man like Lars hide the most important thing he owned? Not in the house, that was too obvious. In the barn? They were already here. He would hide it somewhere no one would ever think to look, somewhere plain, somewhere simple. Her eyes darted around the dim interior of the barn, over the tools, the tack, the hay. And then she saw it. Hanging on a peg by the door, a single worn leather satchel, the one Lars carried with him every single day. So ordinary, so mundane, it was practically invisible. She looked at Jacob, his face set, his pistol aimed at the door. He was ready to die here, for his gold, for his vengeance. He was no better than Lars, no better than Sterling. They were all just men corrupted by greed. But this was her land, her home, and she would not let their war spill over onto it. "I know where it is," she whispered. Jacob's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Where?" She didn't answer him. Instead, she took a deep breath and stood up. "I have the map," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Sterling's head turned, his cold eyes focusing on her. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Jacob grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back down. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Ending this," she said, shrugging him off. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the barn door, toward Sterling. The rain and wind whipped around her, but she didn't flinch. She was a giant, a force of nature, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was the right size. She reached the door and took the leather satchel from its peg. She could feel the stiff parchment inside. "Give it to me," Sterling said, his eyes gleaming. "On one condition," Ingrid said, her voice steady. "You ride out, you and your men, and you never come back. This valley is closed." Sterling laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You're in no position to make demands, Mrs. Sorensen." "Am I not?" she said. She held the satchel over a large rain barrel just inside the barn, a tinderbox and matches in her other hand. "This map is the only thing that proves the gold is here. Without it, your bosses in the East will never fund a full-scale mining operation. It's just a rumor, a ghost story. You need this, but I can live without it." Sterling's smile vanished. He looked from the satchel to her face, and he saw she wasn't bluffing. Jacob was still behind the hay, his pistol ready, but this was her play, her game. "You're a fool," Sterling snarled. "You're sitting on a fortune." "It's not my fortune," she said. "It's my home." The standoff stretched, time slowing to a crawl. The only sounds were the rain and the wind and the frantic beating of her own heart. Finally, Sterling gave a curt nod. "Fine, the map." He took a step forward. "Stay there," she commanded. "Send your men away first. I want to see them ride over that ridge." Sterling hesitated, then let out a sharp whistle. Two other men, who had been hiding in the trees, emerged. He gave them a signal, and reluctantly, they mounted their horses and rode off into the storm. Now it was just the three of them. Her, Sterling, and Jacob, who was slowly rising from behind the hay, his gun still trained on the man in the black coat. "Now, the map," Sterling said, his voice a low hiss. Ingrid looked at the satchel in her hands. This piece of paper had destroyed 3 lives already. It was a curse. She opened the flap, her fingers closing around the stiff parchment. She pulled it out. It was a detailed drawing of the valley, with a dark, snaking line marking the gold vein. It ran right under her cabin. She held it out to him. Sterling's eyes were locked on it, his greed a palpable thing. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, and in that moment, when his attention was completely fixed on the prize, Jacob moved. He didn't shoot. He lunged, tackling Sterling from the side, sending both men crashing into the mud outside the barn. The rifle went flying. Ingrid didn't hesitate. She didn't run to help Jacob. She turned back to the rain barrel, struck a match, and held the flame to the corner of the map. The parchment curled, blackened, and then burst into flame. She held it until the heat licked at her fingers, then dropped the burning remains into the water. It hissed and went dark, turning to a black, pulpy mess. The curse was broken. The gold was a secret again, sleeping beneath the earth. Outside, the sounds of the fight stopped. She turned, her heart in her throat. Jacob was standing over Sterling, his pistol pressed against the man's temple. Sterling was breathing hard, mud and blood on his face. He looked from the rain barrel to Ingrid, his expression one of pure, venomous hatred. "It's over, Sterling," Jacob said, his voice ragged. "Get on your horse and ride. If I ever see you in this valley again, I'll bury you in it." He backed away, his gun never wavering. Sterling slowly got to his feet. He gave Ingrid one last look, a look that promised retribution, then walked to his horse, mounted and rode away, swallowed by the storm. Silence descended. There was only the rain, softer now, and the sound of their own ragged breathing. They were alone. Jacob finally lowered his pistol. He looked at her, at the rain barrel, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. "You burned it," he said, his voice hollow. "Yes. That was our future," he whispered. "Mine and yours." "No," she said, walking toward him until they stood face to face in the rain, the mud sucking at their boots. "That was your past. It was Lars's greed. It was your vengeance. It had nothing to do with me." "I was trying to protect you," he argued, his voice cracking. "You were lying to me," she countered, her voice quiet but unyielding. "You used my loneliness to search my land. You were no different from him." The accusation hit him, and he had no defense. He looked down at his hands, then back at her, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "You're right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After my wife, after what they did to her. I wasn't thinking about anything but hurting them back. The gold. It was a way to do it. A way to ruin them." He looked out at the valley, at her home. "I lost my way. I became just like them. I'm sorry, Ingrid, for lying, for everything." The rain was washing the mud and blood away, leaving only the two of them, stripped of all their secrets and lies. She looked at this man, this broken, vengeful man, and she didn't see a hero or a villain. She just saw someone as lost and lonely as she was. "I made stew," she said, the words feeling strangely familiar, but entirely different from the last time she'd said them. "If you're hungry." They walked back to the cabin, the storm finally breaking. He stood by her fire, dripping on the floorboards, while she ladled out 2 bowls. She handed him one, and their fingers brushed. This time, it felt real. They ate in a new kind of silence. Not the silence of lies, but the silence of exhaustion, of survival. When they finished, he set his bowl down. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. "What you said, that first night. About never being kissed. Was that true?" Amidst all the lies, the gold, the death, it was the one small, simple truth she had offered. "Yes," she said. It was true. He looked at her, and for the first time she felt he was truly seeing her. Not the owner of the land, not Lars Sorensen's widow, but Ingrid. I don't deserve to be the man who changes that, he said, his voice thick with regret. Not after what I've done. No, she said softly. You don't. She stood and walked to the door, opening it to the clean, rain-washed air. The clouds were parting, and a pale, watery sunlight was breaking through. But you're the one who is here. He stood and moved to stand beside her in the doorway. They looked out at the valley, their valley, green and alive after the storm. What happens now? He asked. Now, she said, turning to face him. Now, we start slow. He looked down at her, at this incredible, strong, unmovable woman who had faced down a killer and burned a fortune without flinching. A small, genuine smile touched his lips for the first time. Okay, he whispered, slow. He didn't lean in to kiss her. He just reached out and took her hand. His fingers, rough and calloused, intertwined with hers. It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a fire. It was just a connection. A quiet, steady warmth in the aftermath of the storm. And for Ingrid, who had never been touched with simple, honest intent, it was more than enough. It was everything. They didn't speak of the gold again. It was a ghost they buried together that day, along with the men they had both been married to in their own ways, Lars and the vengeful specter Jacob had become. He started coming by every day, but it was different now. There were no more lies, no more secrets. He wasn't searching for anything. He was just there. He helped her mend the fences Sterling's men had broken. She helped him set the dislocated shoulder he'd gotten fighting Sterling. They worked side by side, falling into a rhythm that was real this time, built not on efficiency but on a shared understanding. They were two survivors, learning how to live again. One evening, he taught her to dance in the barn, not to some hummed tune, but to the sound of the crickets and the wind. She stepped on his feet, and he laughed, a real unburdened laugh that made her heart ache in a good way. She taught him her mother's bread recipe, their hands covered in flour at her kitchen table, and she told him about her dream of being a teacher, a dream she'd buried long ago. He told her about his wife, the real story this time. Not the lie he used as a tool, but the truth of the woman he had loved and lost, the woman whose memory he had nearly tarnished with his quest for revenge. You're not broken, she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars appear. You're just healing. So are you, he said, his voice soft. Spring bloomed across the valley, defiant and beautiful. They planted her garden, their hands moving together in the rich, dark earth. Each seed they planted felt like a promise, not of a fortune, but of a future. A simple, quiet future. One morning, weeks after the storm, she found wildflowers on her porch, tied with a piece of twine. No note, none needed. She knew. That evening, when he arrived, she was waiting for him. I need to tell you something, she said as he dismounted. He walked toward her, his face open, honest. What is it? I think I've been falling in love with you. The words were terrifying, but they were true. Not the man who came here looking for gold, but the man who stayed. He stopped in front of her, his eyes searching hers. Ingrid, he whispered, his hands coming up to cup her face, his touch so gentle it made her want to weep. I think I've been in love with you since the moment you stood up to Sterling and burned that map. I saw who you were, not just strong, you were righteous. Then why didn't you say anything? Because love isn't something you find, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's something you build, and we had to clear the ground first. Tears streamed down her face. The ground is clear now, she whispered. I'm ready. He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. Me too. He leaned down, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She met him halfway. The kiss was nothing like she'd ever imagined. It wasn't a wild, passionate affair. It was quiet. It was gentle. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a pardon, all in one. It was the feeling of coming home. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I never knew," she breathed. "Neither did I," he said, his arms wrapped around her. "Not until you." They married 3 months later, right there on the porch where it had all begun. They combined their ranches, their lives. They built a new story day by day. The people in town talked, of course. They whispered about the night Sterling and his men rode into the valley and left empty-handed. They whispered about the quiet rancher and the giant widow who seemed to have found a peace that defied explanation. They didn't know the truth, not all of it. They didn't know about the gold that slept beneath their feet. They only knew that 2 lonely people, haunted by their pasts, had somehow managed to build a future together. 5 years later, Ingrid stood in her kitchen, a child on her hip, watching Jacob mend a fence in the distance. He looked up, as if he could feel her gaze, and waved. She waved back, a smile spreading across her face. The true treasure hadn't been in the ground. It was right here. It was the life they had built, the love they had chosen, every single day. It was about 2 people who had been brave enough to burn the map and draw a new one for themselves. Brave enough to believe that even after the storm, the sun could still rise. And it did. It rose on a life that was richer than any gold, more precious than any claim. It rose on a love that was, finally, exactly right. If this story reminded you that sometimes you have to burn down the past to build a future, if it made you believe in second chances, then do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. You never know when the next story might be the one you need to hear. Share this with someone who is fighting their own battles, someone who needs to be reminded that they have the strength to face down their own storms. Because stories like this prove that our greatest treasures are not the things we find, but the things we have the courage to build. Thanks for listening. And remember, your story isn't over yet. There's always time to draw a new map.